Now let's concentrate on the primary key. When we're talking about a primary key, we're talking about the whole idea of using a key in a database table. Now, a key is a piece of information. It's a column in the database that helps us identify the records or the rows in a database table. Now, there are three kinds of keys that I can use in my database. And actually, I can use these keys in each table. And that's going to be the primary key, the foreign or referencing key, and then a candidate or an alternate key. And so we will delve into each one of these in their own video. So let's just go ahead and deal with primary key here. Every table that you create, you need to choose a column, or it can be more than one column, that's going to be used to uniquely identify a row in a database table. Think about this for a minute. If I'm storing 5 rows in a table, I can immediately look at that table and say, wait a minute. Row 2 and row 5 are identical. There's no point in storing duplicate data in the table. It's also, if I have duplicate data in the table, it means I might change one row and not change the other. And so now I've got data in my table that's going to be problematic. Depending on which one I select, I'm going to get a wrong answer. So I've got to make sure that all of my rows are unique from each other in the database table. And that's what a primary key does for us. It ensures that every row in the table is different from every other row in the table. Obviously, primary keys can't contain nulls, because if I can contain a null, and a null is something that I don't know, well then it's possible that later when that null gets changed to a value, it could match something else that's already there, so we don't allow those. And it's not a problem, and don't use nulls, it won't let you use nulls. Now, a table can obviously have only one primary key because we can only determine once what uniqueness is. And the primary key is usually what we're going to use to link data from one table to another when we create our relationships. Now, let me just show you a good example here. As we constructed this table, we knew that we were going to store the first and last names and their statuses, whether they're certified. Now, we're not going to deal with normalization issues here. But let's think about this. Could our primary key be the last name? Well, it looks like it right here because everybody's last name is different. But this really won't work in the real world, because what happens if we hire somebody else named Smith? And that's probably going to happen. Depending on what area of the country or the world you're in, you have these common last names that continue to show up. Here in the U.S. and the southeastern U.S., it's like every third person that walks in is named Smith sometimes. So that won't work. Well, can we go by first name? Well, that's even better, because we could have a Jack Smith and a Fred Smith and a Frank Smith, and we could keep them straight by making both of these columns the primary key. But that's not really going to work, because we could have 2 Bob Harrises or 2 Fred Lees. So what we're done is we said, hey, wait a minute. We do have an employee ID that gets issued to every employee when we hire them, and that ID never changes. Now, for a lot of companies, that's a Social Security number. It can be just a generated ID. And so we will make this the primary key. And what's going to happen is in our employees table, that means that I can only have one row in here for Bob Harris, who is employee ID 33. This makes sure that anytime I'm dealing with Bob Harris in my database, that in the employees table, I'm always dealing only with this one row. And so every time we add a new employee, doesn't matter if it's a second employee named Fred Lee, he would have an ID of 39 or greater, and we could always keep those 2 apart. So that's the functionality of a primary key, simply to make sure that none of the other rows in the table are ever duplicates. Now, let me give you one last term before we finish this video, and that is, if I use a single column, then that's a primary key. If I use multiple columns, let's say that I wanted to use the ID, the first and the last name as my primary key. Now that means that some combination of all 3 of these columns has to be unique from everything else. That's called a composite key. Composite simply meaning there's more than one column involved here. So you'll see that term out there, a composite key. And generally you want to use the least amount of columns possible, because the more data you put in there, the harder SQL has to work to maintain information on it. It's more efficient to use smaller keys. So that's a primary key, and later on we will deal with the foreign keys and the candidate keys.